Well, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Exploring API Testing, Challenges and Tools. For this first webinar of 2024, I am joined by Tobias Mueller, CEO at Test Results IO, and Micaela Rodriguez, Test Automator at Abstracta. So Micaela and Tobias will be answering questions during the last few minutes of the webinar. So don't be shy and share your questions on the chat. The floor is yours, Mika.
All right, thank you. All right, so hi everyone. Today we're going to cover different topics. I'm going to be talking about API testing and WireMock as a tool for mocking. So let's jump in. First, we're going to go with client-server communication. Then we'll explore the importance and advantages of testing these services, like why do API testing, right? Next, we'll dive in different strategies for making testing as effective as possible. And finally, we'll take a closer look at the concepts of mocks and demonstrate the use of a well-known tool in this area, that is WireMock. So, in today's tech world, social networking apps are a well-known example of client-server teamwork, we can see. So let's just picture this. When you open like a social networking app, your phone requests the latest post from the app servers using a REST API. So these servers, what they'll do is they'll send back all of the updates, allowing you to browse through photos and videos and share them with your friends. So the integration of a REST API is essential in modern applications that we use daily, right? So in this image that we can see here, we can see how the REST API acts as a mediator between the client and the database, allowing the client to perform operations like creating, updating, and deleting records in the database. But the thing is, how do we know that API services are reliable, right? This is where testing comes in, right? API testing plays a crucial, really important role in ensuring the strength of the bond of the client-server communication. So let's see, why do API testing? To begin with, API testing allows for integration testing. What is integration testing? Is the way we make sure that different components work well together. Also, something really good is it validates functionality early on, which is essential for addressing potential problems before they become larger issues. That is really good for us. And moreover, this results in more efficient development, saving time and resources for us. As well, by catching and fixing errors early, API testing really or greatly improves the product over time. That is really good for our projects. When considering to implement API testing, it's crucial to integrate this within the automation strategy, ensuring efficiency across the different layers of the const test environment. So what is const test environment? Is what we see here at our right. It reflects the testing approach and shows the importance of the different levels that we have in testing. At the bottom of the pyramid, we have unit testing, which is the foundation and it catches issues at an early stage. As we move up the pyramid, the effort and time required for testing increase. We have integration testing, as we mentioned before, that makes sure that components work well together, while UI automated testing ensures a seamless and smooth user experience. And last but not least, at the top, we have exploratory testing, which allows for more like a hands-on approach, more exploratory. But really, I mean, why do API testing? API testing really brings several benefits to the table. Firstly, it allows for early identification of incidents, leading to improved software quality. Also, it results in times and resources savings, along with faster feedback. This is really useful, especially when we are in different projects. And moreover, it ensures the integrity of the system. It contributes to efficient test automation this way. Okay, so we're done with this part. Now we're going to go with different strategies and techniques that we can use in API testing. So I want to clear this out first. When it comes to API testing, there's a bunch of different strategies out there that you can use. But for this talk, I want to talk about these two that are one of my favorites. And one of them is the use of heuristics, which is what are heuristics? They are a creative way that is used to solve common problems that people just came up with and share with the world. So these heuristics applied to API testing, right, might involve analyzing common use cases and different edge cases to determine the most effective testing paths. For example, some of the most popular heuristics used include Vader, Poise, among others. And they each of them focus on different aspects for the API, such as validation, parameterization, and analysis. Another technique that is really, I would say, fun is fuzzing. What is fuzzing? It refers to testing by providing invalid, unexpected, or random data to see how the API or our system responds. So that is a really good one. Well, employing these kind of strategies enables us as testers to evaluate an API's functionality, contributing in this way to the development of a more resilient and dependable API system, which is what we always want. Right. So one of the challenges of automating tests at the API level can arise when APIs depend on external services or those that are outside of our control. We cannot control them, right? To address this, we can use mocks. But what are mocks? Mocks are, let's say, replications of how real objects behave in specific scenarios. When it comes to API testing, mocks are used to imitate the actions of external dependencies, and that helps us to test isolated individual components on their own. Let's take a look at this example. We're developing a payment app that is integrated with different local banks, as we can see in the picture. We need to test the payment functionality, but what happens if the bank service is not available? There we have a problem. This is where mocking services come in handy. We can simulate the behavior of the actual bank service to make sure that our system interacts properly with it without having the real service, right? Also, we don't want to process real transactions every time we run a test. So mocks allows us to execute them without processing real transactions because that would incur a cost to us. All right. So let's take a look at some of the advantages of using mock services. When we use mock services, we gain control over the data that we're using. That helps us when we want to play with edge cases and unusual situations we might come across with. Also, our tests run faster as they don't rely on external services. And well, the isolation provided by mock services helps us find issues within the system being tested rather than in external services. Moreover, we are not reliant on the availability of an external service for our testing. That is really useful because in the previous example that we saw that the bank service was down, this comes in really handy. And lastly, using mock services can help reduce costs, especially when some external dependencies or services have an associated cost per call, like in the payment example. We don't want to use real transactions every time we test. But well, despite the advantages, it's essential to take into consideration the challenges associated with the use of mocking services in API testing. There are some drawbacks. When working with mocks, it's very important to make sure they reflect the behavior of the real API. So in this way, we can maintain authenticity, right? Want them to be as similar as possible as the real service. Also, something to take into account is that maintaining mocks can be of hard work and effort because there's a lot of effort required to keep them updated every time because of what I mentioned earlier that we need them to be as similar as possible as a real service. And another thing that we might want to take a look at is that relying too much on mocks presents a risk because we could bypass testing against the real API and overlook real issues, right? So I personally believe that the way we can mitigate these challenges and these drawbacks are by understanding how to create and use mocks really well before using them. So I've gathered 5 different points that I believe are the most important whenever we're going to start with this, start using mocks and creating them. So let's go over them. Firstly, I do believe that we should take our time to identify the endpoints we need to simulate and gain a real understanding of them. Like, what are they for? What are we going to use them for? And why are they there? Then we should set standard responses for each endpoint, covering both successful and not so positive scenarios. We should have like a broader scope, right? We will also need the help of some tools, specialized tools in creating and not only creating, but updating, deleting mocks, such as WireMock, mock server, or Postman for creating and managing them after we have them. And this one is very important. I always make focus on this point, right? We should direct our application, our app, on the testing environment to the mock and not the real service. And that's the thing about mocking. Also, we should always make sure, and I've repeated this, but we should always make sure that the mock is updated in alignment with any changes in the real API so that it does its function, it does its job. So, well, while multiple tools exist for creating mocks, we have extensively used and we'll be exploring WireMock, right? So let's take a look at it. What is WireMock? Well, WireMock is a flexible and open tool, open source library for mocking web services. It allows us, developers, testers, to simulate HTTP responses as it is based on HTTP and provides a powerful tool for testing API interactions. In this section, right here, we will showcase a practical demonstration of using WireMock to create and manage mocks for various endpoints. So let's jump to the demo. Well, the context is as follows. Let's assume we have an app which serves as a payment platform that communicates with an external service from a bank. Here we have a basic test that verifies the functionality from the payment module that communicates with the bank. We are now going to check that it's working. Going to go to the terminal, going to open a new terminal, split it, and we're going to start both modules, the bank module, and we're going to start the payment module as well. We're going to do that with connects. Okay, the bank module is running. Now I'm starting the payment module, and we're going to go and open our test folder and going to run our tests to check that it's working. All right, as we can see, the test passes as the bank service is up and running. Next, let's assume that the day we run the regression test suite, the bank's test service is down. So what I'm going to do now is finish the process of the bank module. We're going to close it. All right, and we're going to run our test again just to check if it's working or not. All right, now we can't run our test because if we look at it, as the bank service is not available, our test fails because our app directly depends on the availability of the external service, which is the bank. This is where WireMock comes in and saves the day. I already have a Docker container in which WireMock is up. You can download this later. So what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to be running the WireMock image. We can see that it's running. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go to Postman and create the mapping for that response. Let's see. That is what I want my mock to respond when this specific request is performed. So what I have to do in my app now is change the endpoint we're going to point our application to. In this case, it is handled by environment variables. We have QA with the bank test URL, and we have mock with the URL where our mock is running. Now, I will make it point to the mock and not the bank's real service. So I'm going to go to the payment module. I'm going to finish the process, and I'm going to make it point to the mock environment. All right, good. We have it up and running. And if I now run my app and run my test, it should work since the bank's service mock is being used, not the bank's service directly. So let's check that out. Good. Now we can test our application functionalities without depending on the bank test service. Okay, let's go back to the presentation, shall we? All right, before we jump to the VS section of the talk, let's review some key takeaway of this talk that I would like you to take with you. Okay, what I would like you to take with you is let's acknowledge the relevance REST APIs play in modern apps that we use in our daily lives and how much they help us in detecting errors and ensuring data security for reliable systems. That is what we want after all. It is important for you, and I say this as a tester, to explore different testing strategies to see which one fits best for your needs and suits you best when doing testing. Last but not least, I would like you to consider using mocks, knowing what their advantages and challenges are, and why not? Maybe giving WireMock a go, it could be your new ally for testing. So I hope you found this information valuable and applicable to your work. I invite all of you to take a look at Abstracta's blog, and we'll leave a link here in case you want to go further on the topics covered. Now, I'm excited to pass the stage over to Tobias. Over to you. Thank you.
Hi, Mika. Thank you very much. And wow, an impressive presentation, impressive content as well. So yeah, welcome from my side as well to everyone on the stream. Sorry, I do have a cold. It's pretty cold outside here in Switzerland, but I guess we start with the presentation. And let me take you into my world first, because I'm coming from an end-to-end point of view of testing. And what does that mean for API testing? So what you typically see, and what Michaela has also shown with far better graphics than I do, I only have rectangles in my world, is that there's typically a producer and there's a consumer. So like the consumer is your client application that is registering on the server with authentication and is then asking for data, and data is provided. And that's the never-ending circle, actually. That is the communication. And yeah, we all know that's not true. Typically, there's a lot more around that. There's multiple APIs that are used. So the client is using different APIs, and the client is also then using not only APIs, but APIs are using APIs, and it's like a big graph of calls in between all of those different microservices. And that is actually where Michaela implemented something that is pretty impressive with WireMock. Actually, what you do is like, I get rid of all of the complexity. So I do have a mock in here, and my client is tested against that mock. And what I typically call that, or what I think it is actually contract testing. Because what you do is you do have a defined set on how you wanna interact with your client application, and you can simulate all of the different scenarios against your client application and can test the contracts actually. In my world, that is only part of it. So in my world, we do the full API testing, where it's like end-to-end testing, where mocking stuff away is for sure given, because it just saves a lot of time, as Michaela mentioned. But sometimes you just cannot mock it away. And I've seen situations with customers where they mock stuff away, and actually pretty important stuff like authentication, because it's difficult to test, and they just mock it away, and afterwards, yeah, there are problems in authentication because it was never really tested. So that is where I'm coming from, and what I want to show today is different APIs. We cannot mock them away. How do we handle real world scenarios? And all what I'm showing today is more or less like just ideas. So those are typical challenges that we've seen with customers that we solved in one or the other way, and all I can give you are ideas on how to address those challenges. But feel free to actually chat, put stuff in the chat and leave comments if you have better ideas or better solutions to that. Actually, we are all here to learn. So I also want to learn from you. And that's me. That slide is only there to make sure that you get my email address, and just in case you want to stay in contact. Again, I'm the CEO of Test Result Zero, and therefore we are doing full end-to-end testing. I'm also involved in day-to-day projects for our customers. So all of what I'm going to show is real-life information. So the first idea that I had on API testing, also based on some webinars that I watched, and also like coming from customers, is that you should induce failures. And we have seen that in Michaela's presentation a little bit, where it was about fuzziness, fuzzy testing. But I think I want to go a step further, because fuzzy testing is typically, I know which data I need to provide, and I know that I provide wrong data now, and therefore I expect some different response code. And that is actually brilliant. The thing is just like what I learned in the past is who tests my test, and that is always a philosophical question in most of those discussions. But today I want to give you something practical that you can take out there and put it into place in the real world. It's like if we take the typical example that you see from every tool vendor, the typical login scenario, how would you test a login? And I give you that. My examples are simplified. So how would I test the login? The first check is naturally the positive, the happy pass. I get the credentials from somewhere where it's saved securely, and then I post some kind of JSON for the REST API to some endpoint that's called login, and then I expect that I get at least a 200 as a status code back. Perhaps I get some kind of response object. I can check that as well. And that is one check, and the other check is naturally do the same with invalid credentials, and you would expect like something around 501 not authenticated, or 400 bad request, whatever, or a different response object, and that is all fine. So we tested it. But the thing is, what makes that test precise? Actually, what I mean is, like, if you have 10,000 tests like that, and if you do have a real set of API tests, you will end up in the 10,000, 50,000 error range of tests that you run automatically. And if everything is green all the time, it is actually brilliant, but on the other side, it also makes me a bit afraid of it. Like, does it really test something? And that is where the first idea is coming from. What we are implementing for our customers is this induced failures into the test without the test knowing it. And that means more or less like you say, I get my credentials, I get the real credentials, and sorry for the lagging on the video, but it's a long, long way from Switzerland out there to the world. And we do have some speed limits on the roads, and they are pretty low. So that is why you get the video stream a bit delayed. And there's a lot of stuff where you get the real credentials, and then you add random fake credentials without knowing if they will have a successful login or not. And what you do then is you take the randomness and say, I post the login with the following data. And that is actually important, that you somehow log the data that you use for the login. And the test is still against this 200. So you still check against this response code of 200. And now the important part starts. Because you can imagine, like, if you have 10 different credentials and one of it works, there's a chance 1 out of 10 that it passes, and the other 9 instances it will fail. And that is actually what we expect, but we cannot bring that into the test, because we actually want to test the test every time that it is executed. And therefore, we need to put that logic somewhere else. So we do have something like a centralized repository in X-Ray, or manually in Jira, or some other management tool that you use for all of your test management, where you actually maintain a list that maps data inputs to expected outcomes. More or less like you have a layer on top of the test where you say, like, if those inputs were used in the test, it is okay that it passes. If those values were used in the test, then it should actually fail. So I expect it to fail, so that I see that it really tests the system, and that I don't have like 10,000 tests that just say return true and everything is green. Because that is actually the problem. If you have everything green all the time, are we sure that we are testing the right thing? There's nothing worse for me, and also for my customers actually in that sense, than having all of the tests that are always green. And that being said, it brings us to the next idea, which is a bit around contract testing. And that is something that I experienced, and I experienced all of the pain with one of our customers' projects and also with our internal projects as well, is like, do you even know the contract that you are testing? Because using WireMock for mocking is actually brilliant. But what I've seen in the real world is that you get something like what I've seen, what I've shown here on the slide, is you have some kind of JSON that you get back. And my question is like, do you guys out there really test the contract? It's even better. Do you actually know the contract? Because what you know is, hey, I call this API endpoint and I get the following response if I do have my header set up correctly and all of the stuff. And you'll get this response. So is there any error in that response? And I've also already prepared that because typically in those virtual situations, there are not that many questions and there's not that many interactions. So if you look at that, you will see that I highlight those numbers in there. And that is what most people don't see and most people never test. Because the result is perfectly correct JSON. And your current version of the application might be able to parse it. But that is just because the parsing in the application is lazy. So it is using something that when it says like, I'm identifying a string that only contains a number, I will actually say that is a number or like an integer. And what you see in here is like this JSON tells us like X and Y and also the point count is actually a string. So an array of characters. And we just said like, yeah, but the content is correct, so everything passes. And that is actually true in Postman as well. You get the result back and everything is perfect. And that is because you don't know the contract. And most of the people that I see outside actually completely miss the part of the JSON schema. And that is the same that was like in XML, you also had a data type definition language, which was barely used for all the custom data entities. And that's exactly the same problem now with REST APIs and JSON again. So what you see over here is like, if X is a number, this is actually invalid JSON. Because you cannot, I have the JSON definition on the right here, you cannot define a number with quotes around it. And if you check your API today, you will, I'm pretty sure 90% of you guys in the audience will actually see responses where something is in quotes that shouldn't be. Like Boolean values that shouldn't be in quotes. Numbers shouldn't be in quotes. Null values, empty values. Is there a difference between empty values and null values? Check for yourself. And that is the second idea that I want to show you, that I want to bring you, that you want to make you aware of, is like, if you use Postman, for example, today, make sure that you either get a JSON schema from all of your API providers or sit there, discuss with the developers or whoever is in charge of the API definition and make sure that you generate a JSON schema. Because we actually had that with a customer and also with our internal systems, is that we use, for example, JSON for net, which was downloaded at least 1 billion times. So I know most of the .NET, Microsoft .NET based system outside use that library actually to parse JSON, and it just accepts a string and converts it automatically into an integer. But if you switch your library, like saying from JSON.NET to system.text.json in the Microsoft world, the second library is more strict. And none of your tests will pass anymore. And that's not the worst part, actually. Your client application will crash as well, because it is expecting different data types. So I just want to make you aware that there is something out there that is called a JSON schema. Please use it, apply it. And also Postman supports it, test results are supports it, provide a schema and make sure that you test your APIs with a schema defined. Otherwise, you might have actually hidden bugs that would have been easy to find. Yeah, and that is actually the link to the schema for JSON, so that you really learn about the underlying data persistence system. The next idea that I had is about authentication, because if you can mock everything away, everything is fine. You just mock the complex parts away and you just send a response. Actually, you put in a bearer token and the mock just responds with like, hey, everything is fine. You are authenticated. You are administrator, super administrator. Everything is fine. But how do you test OAuth 2 logins today? And that is actually pretty interesting. typically what I see in the field is that you set up your secrets in Postman, like you fill in all of those fields that you get, you set up your application with the app secrets, and you get the key for the application that you set up, put in that key as a client secret in Postman and stuff like that. You generate a token, you store the token, and you share it within team or in Postman somewhere in the shareable team setting workspace, and then you check for the OK so that you can actually log in with that bearer token. Yeah. And I think all of you have experienced that in the past. Is like 2 months later, all of the tests are red because they cannot authenticate anymore because the bearer token is expired. And the 2 months might actually be a bit exaggerated. So it might be only a week or only a day or 2 days. But I wanted to show you a point is like where you cannot rely on the token that you generated once. And there's something in OAuth2 called the refresh token, which is actually used by all of the applications that are using OAuth as a system for authentication. But most of the API testing tools out there did not support the refresh token out of the box. Actually, I was pretty sure that Postman doesn't support it till I looked it up for this presentation. And actually, I found out that since August last year, so that is like 6 months from now in the past, they added a feature that they can support refresh tokens. And that's important. That is a setting that by default is always disabled. And I don't know why, because that is something that all of the applications do. By definition, they need to use the refresh token to refresh the credentials. But in all of the API testing, in all of the different tools that are used for API testing, this refresh token is never used. Most of the time, you recreate a default bearer token actually from the credentials. But please, please, please test the APIs as the client would actually use it. So the client application would use it and use those refresh tokens. And for Postman, I actually put a screenshot in here, but you can also look up Postman OAuth2 refresh token, and I guess a video will show up. It's just a little checkbox that you need to check, and Postman will behave differently afterwards, so it actually refreshes the token if it is required. So it knows once the bearer token is about to expire and knows exactly how long the refresh token can be used to refresh the bearer token, and uses that automatically. So please enable that if it's required. If you're using the tool that doesn't support refresh token today, think about the tool again. I can't say anything else because most of the tools are not extensible. If you use an open source tool that doesn't support it, please add it and do a pull request for that. And that brings me to my fourth idea that I often see in the field, which is two-factor authentication. And I'm pretty sure, like, again, 90 to 100% in the audience, all of the testing is actually in testing and staging areas, and you just cut away two-factor authentication if it's applied in the product. And that means, like, the authentication is never really tested in real-world scenarios, because testing authentication is hard. It is a hard topic because it needs to be secure. So that's the same, and I put that on the slide. Actually, that's the same as if you want to check DRM protected content. I mean, DRM protection is there to make sure that you cannot check into that content, but if you want to check the quality of the content, you somehow need to handle that DRM protection. And the same is true for two-factor authentication. So if there is an API that requires a two-factor authentication, and more and more and more applications and therefore APIs switch over to two-factor authentication, like this OTP stuff, and you need to actually be able to test that. You can mock it away for sure to test all of the other functionality, but as part of your regression tests against your APIs and also daily, nightly tests, you should check it actually with the authentication enabled. And this is the part where I need to tell you, be cautious. Because you know it, in the end, this whole OTP and two-factor authentication stuff, it's still the same 6-digit codes that we had in the 20s and 2010s. It's like with those side tricks, and most of you might still remember that, where you had to press the button to generate the 6-digit key, and it's still the same old technology. So what we need to do for our testing our APIs, test automation, is like you typically get those barcodes over there, and that is a valid barcode. You can try that with your Google Authenticator app, your Microsoft Authenticator app, whatever app you use, and it will actually give you valid tokens. The thing is, if we do API testing, we don't want to have Google Authenticator somewhere involved, because that is on some smartphone somewhere, and if we don't want to have a full-blown end-to-end testing just for the authentication. And For that, actually, I want to show you how to do that. And the trick on that is within this QR code, I guess, and I hope most of you have seen that meanwhile, within this QR code, there's nothing else than a URL. It's a dedicated URL schema for one-time tokens. And I put in here like, do not use an online service, because that is an advice that you typically get if you Google for that. You should make sure that you never put like one of those QR codes on some public web page to actually get the content of the QR code, because it includes the secret. So all of the get with the QR code is like the secret and the algorithm that is actually applied to deduct the six-digit code from the secret. So if you put your QR code on some public page, congratulations, you just shared your private secret to log in as a second factor in the API. So use a local solution. There are enough pages online, check it out, to analyze the QR code that you get and then store all of that secret information in your tests. And from there on, you can actually generate these OTP tokens by yourself, like in Postman. There are JavaScript libraries that you actually just provide the secret, the algorithm, the number of digits, and the period, the time period that it's valid to. And then actually you have this JavaScript library or TypeScript library that is generating the six-digit tokens for you. And you can use that in the API authentication, even if two-factor authentication is enabled. You don't need a smartphone. You don't need Google Authenticator. You don't need any dependencies or anything else. You can use it in pure Postman or whatever tool you use. You can also use it in test results naturally. And just use those two-factor authentication in all of your testing, so you don't need to disable that anymore in testing and staging environments. Just as a little reminder, what I do have on the slide is just one version of this OTP protocol, which is the time-based protocol, which is based on RFC 4226. You can actually look that up if you want to see how it works. It is actually pretty simple. There's another one that is based on counters. So if you create the first token, then the first one is gone. Then you have to create a second token, and those counters are actually synced between the server and the client, and therefore you still need to calculate that. It's just a different way of calculating it, but in the end, it works exactly the same way, and it gives you the tremendous freedom that you don't need to ask anybody to disable two-factor authentication in any of the testing environments. And I have seen that in the real world all the time, that people are asking how to disable two-factor authentication. We don't need to test that anyway. That is a trusted service from OAuth 0 or whatever. And don't do that. Don't cut away the most important stuff of your application, because if the authentication doesn't work, none of your users will ever be able to log in. And you might not believe me, but that was in one of my first projects. Is the first presentation with the customer, 6 customers from management were there, and they couldn't log in because authentication didn't work. Perfect job. So that brings me to my last idea for today, which is if you use automation in API testing, and that is important because there's the kind of exploratory API testing, and there's also automated API tests. From my point of view, I always look like which parts can be automated, what is useful to automate, and that is exactly one of the parts where I say like automation is tremendously helpful because you already do it anyway. So my idea number 5 on that one is actually that you check the URI that you do, or URL, or however you call it, that you have against all the different verbs that HTTP provides you. So you don't, if the API supports a get, you also do a post, you do a patch, you do an options, you do all of the different verbs on the same URL. It's for free anyway. It's already automated. The call is already automated. You can just add it to an expected list of like, if I do a post, I would expect 400 bad requests or whatever. Because what you do not want to see your customers to have is like an HTTP error code of 500, which says like server error, because then I know there is a bug on the server side. And that is part of real API testing. It's not only by I request a JSON object and I get a JSON object back and I make sure the JSON object contains all of the elements. It is also testing the consumers and the producers of that API. That is real API testing. And for that, you want to make sure that from a publicly facing API, the server cannot be crashed in any way. The second one is you already do automation, so you can use parameters in all of your tests. That is, if you use Postman today, you're thinking in like JSON and you put in the JSON stuff in there. Get rid of that way of thinking. put in some abstract kind of data structure where you say like, hey, this is the information that I have. Let's say I want to update or I want to post a customer. So I do have a first name, a last name, and an age, for example. I don't put that in as JSON. I do have my dedicated data structure where I have like first name, last name, and an age. And I do have additional fields for those fields which allow me to say like this field can be randomized. So for example, the first name can be randomized. And by randomized, I mean like you do have a rule set underneath that says like, if I can randomize, I test with all of the different edge cases. Like I think Michaela also mentioned that like empty strings in there, extremely long strings, special characters, only numbers, like a lot of different kind of white spaces, all of the stuff that is out there, Unicode characters, Unicode encodings, double byte encodings, actually double byte encodings that delete the previous character, stuff like that. Put that all in your data structure and then deviate all of the test case from that data structure automatically. You can actually do that in Postman pretty easy. If you need to have any advice, just let me know. You have my email address in the presentation, and that is why I actually I think I'm promoting the idea of having automated API tests. The exploration part of the APIs is useful and is extremely, I think, extremely important also for security measure where you need to understand like different attack vectors where you can only say like, we do some automated testing to prove that we have the bare minimum, but the rest is really exploratory testing. But for stuff like that, where you already do have some automation, you can actually bring that automation to the next level and make sure that the producer, so your server, doesn't crash at all, because that is what you don't want to see in a publicly facing API. And with that being said, that's it. That is all of my ideas for today. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. Other than that, I'm happy to have Michaela back, actually. That was a long monologue on my side. And let's see. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, that was awesome, guys. Super interesting. So before we move on to see if there are any questions on the chat, I have a few questions on my own for you. So Mika, which resources would you recommend for someone who wants to learn more about API testing?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Thus. I would recommend all of you to check out Abstract Academy. It's our academy where we have different courses in Spanish and English. And Test Automation University, you have different courses on automation, API testing, and different types of testing. They have great courses. And also maybe read up on testing strategies and check out Abstract's blog. Why not? We have different posts there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mika. Okay, and Tobias, are there any tools you can recommend?
Actually, thanks for pronouncing my name perfectly fine, Paz. That is actually still, I'm still amazed on that. Your pronunciation is perfect. Do I have any recommendation for tools? In general, any of those tools should actually solve the problems. But what we've seen in the presentation is like, for example, Postman didn't support refresh token till late last year. So I think you should choose the tool based on what you need and based on what you understand on the testing. Naturally, I can always tell like, hey, test results is the best tool on the planet, which might not be true for your case. And therefore, it's based on a case-to-case decision. But yeah, use something like Postman, use something like SoapUI. Those tools are, I mean, the distribution of those tools is that tremendous that you always find some workaround if the tool still doesn't support it. Same is true for test results here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tobias. Okay, back to you, Mika. Which are the main benefits of using heuristics in API testing?
Well, to be honest, there are a variety of reasons why I would choose to do heuristics in API testing, but I would say that firstly, they're a fun way to see testing strategies. And well, they help you thinking of more scenarios to test. Like they broaden your scope. They make your testing approach broader and more systematic. That's why I choose them every time. Thanks, Beth.
Interesting. Awesome. And back to you, Tobias. Is there anything in API testing that you would not automate?
Yes, that is actually a good question. Yeah, the answer is yes, a clear yes. something like the security testing, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's like I would automate a base layer, and there are tools already out there that do that. And you also have Postman rules for that. But I would never put the real secure stuff like on an automation. It's like more like you have the basic and you have this minimum security, and then you do exploratory API testing on, like, because you need to understand, like, you need to identify different passes through those APIs and where you can actually break out of something that the developers actually constrained you in and stuff like that. That is something that I think would only automate a part of it, and the rest is always exploratory.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tobias. And already moving on to the last few questions, we have some shy people. We didn't receive any questions on the chat, so I will just continue with my own. So Mika, what are the advantages of using mocks to control data in API testing?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say, well, as we saw, mocks have lots of advantages of using them, but well, we could say that they let you simulate different scenarios regarding data, especially edge cases and unusual situations we might come across. They basically help you test how your API behaves under different conditions, and that's really nice. It adds a lot of value.
Okay, and I have one last question for you, Mika. How do you ensure that the mock accurately reflects the behavior of the real API?
Well, that's a really interesting question that most of us do every time. I would say for everyone, please stay updated with the API versions, and documentation is key every time. This will help you know what responses to expect when testing. So please pay attention to documentation and stay updated.
Awesome, outstanding. Okay, so it's sad, but we are about to be done for today. Micaela, Tobias, thank you both so much for your time today, your information, the presentations. It was great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in today's webinar, Exploring API Testing Challenges and Tools. We'll see each other in the next webinar. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.